welcome to Working Dragon Mystic. I'm Drake. I've been getting a lot of questions about how to work with an entity or how to find the correct entity to work with. And that's a pretty big topic to unpack, but I did want to sit down and give a quick overview and some examples of ways to get started. Because there's a big difference in how I would do it when I first started and how I do it now. And really the only difference is the skill set that's required. And the stuff I do now requires a great deal of journey work and evocation, which not everybody has those skills developed just yet. So that said, even when I don't do those things, even still today, there is a method I use that I honestly believe anyone can do, and it's the method I started out using. So if you follow this outline, you should be okay. Now, when we say find an entity, what are we talking about? Well, that really depends on your personal practice. You could be seeking out a deity to work with, a spirit, angel, any form of entity, even demons. Some people do actually prefer to work with demons. As some of you know, dragon magic is one of my primary focuses, so I do work a lot with dragons. That said, though, I still do work with just about every other entity that you can name. But how do you do this? Well, this is the part people don't like, but it starts with research. Now, there's two ways that this is going to happen. You always hear stories of this entity came to me. I saw this entity in a dream. This entity got my attention. That can happen. But I'll be honest with you, that's not the norm. That's actually the exception. And oftentimes, it's even superimposed over the actual second option. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. Now, for me, I practiced for, I would say, a good 7 or 8 years before an entity reached out to me first. But even then, I'll try and talk about how you would handle that. But the first step is research. Regardless of how it goes, whether you're the one seeking or whether the entity reaches out to you, you want to do your research. Look into who the entity is. Where do they come from? Look into the stuff about what culture surrounds the entity. What time period was this entity a really big deity? What's it supposed to be the god of if it's a deity? Where in the world was this deity primarily worshipped? And what are the beliefs of the people who worshipped it originally? Now, all this is just target points for research. And I always say at least find 4 sources for your research. At least 4 different sources. So you can get a broader opinion of who this entity is. A perfect example is when you look at Norse mythology, the stories and the myths are drastically varied depending on what source you're looking at. And if you can look at the Proetus or something similar, those are usually your better sources, but they're harder to interpret. And then you have books that deal with Asatru and heathenry and all this. And I'll be honest, as someone who's read a bunch of those, every book gives you almost a completely separate idea of who these entities are. But there are commonalities. And it's the commonalities that you're looking for as you're doing your research. Because ultimately you're trying to get a general idea of who this entity is. No book, no paper, no document, nothing will tell you exactly who that entity is. And there's a reason for that as well. Now, the reason I say research is where you start regardless of whether you're the one seeking an entity or whether the entity made contact with you is because any entity can contact you. And you want to make sure that this is an entity you want to work with before you jump in. And doing your research gives you a ballpark idea of whether you feel you and this entity would get along. And I'm not talking about do you align, do you have the exact same belief systems. I'm literally talking about do you get along. There's a lot of people who I'm really good friends with. We have very, very different beliefs. So when I'm doing my research, I'm looking at who the entity is. And I'm trying to ask myself, can I get along with them? Is it somebody I could do business with? Is it somebody I could call a friend? Is this someone I can trust? Is this someone I can count on? These are the kinds of things I'm looking at. And you're only going to get a general idea in your research. So let's also be clear there. You're only getting a general idea. Now another thing is you will usually find them in a list of God of. And it's like everybody tries to put entities into this little box. And they just kind of give them this little portfolio. This is your job. This is all you do. And a lot of people's going to disagree with me on this, and that's fine. But I've worked with hundreds of gods and hundreds of other entities as well over the years. And I'll be honest with you, none of them fit in those boxes. It is true that the box is a section of who these entities are, so the box is relevant. But do yourself a favor and actually work with the entity, listen and learn from the entity, and learn who they genuinely are, the same way you would a person, because they're more than that box. Don't try to put them in the box. Let them out of the box. The box is relevant, but also be prepared to expect them to step out of that box and show you sides of themselves that they may never have shown to anyone else that isn't recorded anywhere. So be ready for that. So when they're talking God of, I usually try to throw that out to the most part and actually approach the entity and try to learn about them and who they are directly. Which brings us into the next point. How do you do that? Well, I used to use a step process, and like I said, I still use it. It's always been a reliable process for me. The first thing I would do after I've done my research, I'd take that knowledge and I would take that to meditation. Now, when I would go to meditate, I would use focused meditation, and I'd focus on the deity or the entity's name. And if they have a symbol or a sigil of some kind, I would also keep that with me. I'd have that on a piece of paper, and I'd be looking at that while I meditated. And the whole idea in this meditation is you're connecting with that energy, you're connecting with that consciousness, and you're going to be feeling that presence around you. Now, this is important, in my opinion, because we all meet those people that we just meet them and there's just something about them. We don't like them. Now, sometimes this proves false. More often than not, it proves true. So when you're spending that time in that presence, this kind of gives you an idea of what kind of vibe you're going to feel when you're around this entity. Now, this isn't always a bad thing, because if it makes you uncomfortable, part of what could be making you uncomfortable is there's a big change coming, and generally speaking, most humans don't like change. That makes us uncomfortable, even though we love when things change for the better. But whether it's a negative change or positive change, it's uncomfortable. So be aware of that, but this starts giving you an ideal of the entity. And I generally would say meditate at least 3 nights with the entity and go through this meditation. I would even do it up to a week. Now, the next thing I would do when I developed the ability was trance work, and that's you drop into that real deep meditation state. And I would reach out to the entity to speak with them in trance work. And I would generally set this up in 3 stages. 1, I would meet the entity on the astral plane or the crossroads, depending on your practice. So it's kind of a neutral ground. And I would spend as much time with them as I can. I'd ask them questions. I would literally just sit and talk, just like you're developing a friendship here. You're inviting them for coffee. So the crossroads and the astral plane are essentially the public coffee shop where you can have a cup of coffee safely, talk, and get a better idea and a better measure of each other. The next thing that I would do progressively from there is I would actually do trance work to my Arcane Sanctum. We mentioned this in the Arcane Senses video, and I should probably do a whole video on it because it's literally like your own little demi-plane in the astral plane. And so now you're inviting them to a location of yours as a guest. And again, I would continue that process of using this meditation and trance work to build it up. And again, if you can't really get into a trance state, that's fine. Just continue the meditations. Even do a guided meditation or a visualized style meditation doing these exact things will be fine. But after a while, don't be surprised if they invite you to their plane. And you could do the trance work so that you actually visit their plane. That's actually not too uncommon. But yeah, trance work is where I'd bump up the meditation from if you have already learned trance work. But if not, don't worry about it. Don't sweat it. Not an issue. Just continue with the meditation and getting to know the entity. Now, how long should you do this? That's kind of a personal matter, because the general rule of thumb that I was taught is do it till you're comfortable with the entity. That's kind of what I was taught. So if after let's say you did this for 2 weeks and every night you're working with this entity, and at the end of those 2 weeks you're seriously just not comfortable around this entity at all in any way, odds are that's not an entity you want to work with just yet. You can revisit the idea later, or the contact you've made, you may find that if you walk away from the meditations, the entities now might reach out to you when you're better ready to work with them or be comfortable around them. You may also notice they reach out to you if the main reason for your uncomfort is that they do genuinely have something to offer you and help you, that if you walk away, they'll tend to reach out and try and get your attention again in some way. But again, I would only give it max of 2 weeks for the meditations if I'm uncomfortable. If it remains an uncomfortable situation, that's it. I step away. And sometimes I do so sooner depending on how extreme that is. Because there's some entities I've approached and they made it very clear they wanted nothing to do with me. And it's like, okay, got it. So I walked away. Okay, so you've been doing the meditation and trance work for a few weeks now or longer, depending on how comfortable you are, and you decided, I do want to work with this entity. This is an entity I genuinely want to work with. How do I do it? What do I do now? Well, the first step is what some people refer to as acknowledgement or communion rites. Some people even will call it a dedication rite, but I don't like calling it that because you're not dedicating yourself to anything in this ritual. In fact, one of the best names for this form of ritual that I've heard is actually called the hailing rite. And that's H-A-I-L, which is a word of honor and greeting as well as farewell. You always used to hail the sailors home. You would hail the ships. You would hail the soldiers as they came back. So it was a word of honor, it was a word of respect, and it was a greeting and a farewell. This is why in so many different forms of medieval lore and everything, you always hear them using the word hail as a greeting. And you'd also hear hail and farewell. So calling it a hailing rite is actually perfect in my mind at the very least, because that's exactly what you're doing. You're greeting the entity as a friend, you're showing respect to them, and you're showing honor to them. The same as you would a dear friend that you're seeing out and about, welcoming into your home, all that stuff. Now, a hailing rite or an acknowledgement rite, what it is, it's very basic and simple. There's no fluff to it, really. All you need to do is set up your work area, whatever your work area is. Even if you don't have a work area, you can actually do this laying in your bed or sitting in a chair. You literally need nothing. Everything you add to it's just an extra, and that's fine. But at its core, it's just getting into a meditative state, or even just taking a few deep breaths. You would say a welcome, a greeting to the entity. You'd call its name. Some people only do it once. In some traditions, you hear that saying the name 3 times is best, because 3 times guarantees you have the entity's attention. And you would actually just talk to them. I mean, some people would say you say a prayer to them, but you can also just talk to them and tell them how you're doing, ask how they're doing. And this is the point where if you want to ask them for teachings, wisdom, blessings, healing, any of those things like that that you would normally associate with asking a prayer, you can do that. But anytime you do this, you want to give them gratitude, and you want to show them respect. That's why it's referred to as an acknowledgement ritual. Because anytime you do this ritual, you're acknowledging them and you're acknowledging your respect for them. And they will actually in turn do the same thing. They'll reciprocate that. So you literally need nothing. You can sit down, do it anytime, anywhere. Now, if you want to offer up an actual gift or offering, you can do so. And many entities have many different things listed in their history for offerings that you can give. That said, since this is just a gift, you can literally give anything. The only rule I've ever attached to this is give them something that you yourself like. Don't give them the stuff you don't want. That's the only rule I've ever attached to this. So me, I will never give an offering of tomatoes. I do not like tomatoes. I know, a southern boy who don't like tomatoes, that's a sin. Oh God. We exist. I don't like them. Can't stand them. They gag me. So I would never actually give tomatoes as an offering because to me it feels like I'm giving them the produce I don't want. And I'm going to keep the stuff I do want for myself. That's not a gift for me. For me, a gift is something that I would value too. Though there are exceptions to this rule because clearly there are entities that they very specifically like very specific things that you may not. In that case, giving that item to them shows that you know them and you care about what they like. So if, in my example, there was an entity, which I honestly can't think of one, that tomatoes were their thing, I would happily give them a tomato, just as if I have a friend over that likes tomatoes, I will serve them. I have no problem with that. That's what they like. That's what they enjoy. I want to be a good host, and I want them to know I care. Which actually happens quite often in my house because my wife eats tomatoes all the time. So there you go. But keep the gift something considerate. If you don't have something that perhaps that is listed as common offering, and again, let's look at the Norse. Even with its resurgence in popularity, mead is not something that is easy to find most places these days. But you don't have to give mead. You can give water if that's all you have. You can give any form of alcohol if you got it. Beer. I mean, you can give anything. It doesn't have to be mead as a beverage. And honestly, like I said, water is just fine. I've even seen people give milk and grape juice. Anything that you give as a genuine, heartfelt gift, perfect. If you choose to give it. You don't have to, again, because you can just sit down and you can talk with them. Now, me, there's times when I don't really have a lot to say, but I still want to show my gratitude or that I'm thinking about them. And ladies might have an easier time with this because guys, we really don't do thinking of you cards. But that's kind of what this is. So I usually, for every entity I work with, I'll write up some little short phrase. And I'll use that every time I do the ritual. So for example, with Freya, she's a goddess I do work with a lot. I usually say, Hail Freya, goddess of love and beauty, queen of the Valkyries, goddess of war and magic. And that's actually how I would address her every time. And then I would close it with something like, watch over me, bless me, guide me, and teach me. And then at the bottom, I just say, Hail Freya, Hail Freya, Hail Freya. As short and simple as that is, if I have nothing else to say, but I still want to show my gratitude and let her know I'm thinking of her, that's what I'll do. And I can do that while sitting at my computer. I can go into my working area. I can even do it while driving my car if need be. But when we're talking about an acknowledgement ritual or a hailing ritual, that's all that's needed. Now, if I wanted to add to that, yes, I could give an offering to her. And also, after I do the hailing ritual, so after the, Hail Freya, Hail Freya, Hail Freya, if I have time, I can sit and meditate. and which jumps us back up to where we were, but now you're spending time in that presence as well, and you've made that personal, physical connection with the hailing ritual, and that's a great way to commune with these entities. And that's the kicker. You're communing. You're building a relationship here. Many of you know I'm not very religious in any way. To me, these entities, even on the ones we view as deities, to me, they're friends and allies. So I approach them with respect. I approach them with honor. I approach them as an equal, but I do view them as friends and allies. And I want them to be able to trust me as much as I can trust them. So it's a give and take relationship, at least from my perspective, and that's important to me. Now, if you're approaching them as a genuine divinity and you want to add that layer of worship, there's nothing wrong with that. This will work for you all just as well. I'm not saying it won't. In fact, oftentimes that layer of worship, most people find it easier to follow this process because when you're doing the communion or the acknowledgement ritual, that you're giving of the worship to them. So many who come at it from a religious viewpoint actually do tend to find this a little easier. And from a religious standpoint, some people have a little easier time finding an entity because their religion tends to point them in a direction, because they tend to follow a belief system that better frames a culture. Not always, but usually. Now, during your acknowledgement or communion rituals, this is when you're really going to build that strong connection, because during your meditations you found out this entity is one that you would be interested in, and during the hailing rituals you've been taking time to meditate, and you've also been asking for blessings and knowledge and wisdom. So you have already at this point been working with them to some extent. Now this is where I highly recommend that you set aside the research finally. Now, if all you have is meditation, you can use that. If you can use trance work, you can use that. If you have any knowledge in invocation or evocation, you can also use that. But what I recommend at this point is you set aside all the stereotypes, you set aside all that data, and you start learning directly from the entity who they are. And you're going to find a very interesting thing, because every entity will present a different personality based upon who they're talking to. Just like humans do. Every human treats every friend a little differently. We may treat them with the exact same principles, but since it's two individuals, the friendship between them is itself individual and cannot be exactly like the same friendship you have with this person. And your relationship with any entity is going to function the same way. So your relationship with whatever that entity is going to drastically differ from someone else's, or it can. And I do highly recommend that you actually nurture that relationship and you let those entities be who they are, and you try to be yourself to them, and you find a way to respectfully work together and truly build a genuine friendship with them. Now, I know that this part here is probably upsetting some people, because I know a lot of people who's like, well, that entity don't do that. Well, that entity wouldn't do that. And, you know, that's your opinion. You're welcome to it. In my experience over the years, these entities are far more than we give them credit for. And they do seem to highly reward those people who actually treat them as real people and are genuinely willing to get to know them, to talk to them, to laugh with them. There's times I've actually done evocation rites or journey work for no other reason than just to spend time with the entity. I didn't actually have a goal. I had no purpose for doing it other than I just wanted to go see a friend. How many times have you gone to a friend's house for no reason other than to hang out? You just miss them. And that's what I do. I don't only contact them when I need something. I do genuinely treat these entities as friends and allies. And to me, that's what they are. So, as you can see, there are things you can add to this process, but really all you need is meditation. And I say it time and time again, meditation is the foundation of all occult and magical practices. So you should have a good, solid meditation practice. That said, even if you're just starting out your meditation practice, this process is a great way to get your practice. So I hope everyone enjoyed this, because this is a process anyone can use. Oh, and I was going to say, you know, I said some people, even when they do the research, they overlay it. And they say that deity called them. Well, some people believe that if you're doing your research, that during the research you'll be drawn to one entity, and the entity that you approach and the entity you find, that is that entity getting your attention. There's no way to prove or disprove it. In fact, it could very well be the fact. And in many cases, you will be drawn to one entity over another because, I don't know, its attributes, its personalities, even the way it looks, the artwork of the culture, its symbol, any little thing can catch your eye. And that very well could be the entity trying to catch your eye. So when I said that the two can overlap, that was what I was meaning. But again, regardless of how it goes, whether you're researching or whether an entity approaches you, it starts with research and then moves into meditation. Anyways, I highly encourage you to actually apply this and get to working with it, because you'll make some wonderful friends and allies. And I think it'll add a lot to your practice. And the information and knowledge you can learn from these entities is amazing. It is. It really is. It's my favorite part of my practice, in all honesty. So definitely use this, try it out, and leave a comment below. Let us know how it went. And remember, if you haven't already, to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so that you'll get any notifications anytime we release a new video. And I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm Drake, and this has been Working Dragon Mystic. I'll see you next time.